Welcome to the end of Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus, chapter 6. Here we go. We're jumping right into it. It's the last day. He continues his specific instructions that he started in chapter 5. He talked to wives, husbands. Now he's going to the children, and then he goes to the fathers. Real quick thing, I should have said this yesterday. In the ancient world, unfortunately, but probably it comes as no surprise to you, that women did not have the rights or the value that men had. And so for Paul to publicly address husbands and tell them how to treat their wives, people would have been shocked. But again, he's following Jesus's example of giving value to everybody. The playing field is level, and all of us have been made in the image of God. And so he's doing something that's totally countercultural by telling men how they should be treating their wives. And he does the same things here. He talks to children. He says, obey your parents. Amen. And then he talks to fathers. And he tells them not to provoke their children to anger. Or the NIV, what does the NIV say? It says, don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up with like discipline and instruction in the Lord. Now, to give fathers instructions, that was pretty intense. But Jesus gave value to children. He told the children to come to him and not to hinder them. And so for Paul to publicly say, okay, like for the good of the children, hey, dads, here's how you need to treat your kids. That was pretty intense. But pretty cool. Then he goes on to slaves and masters. All right, now this is important. Does the Bible endorse slavery? No. However, when you think slavery, you probably think American history slavery. This is slavery in the Roman Empire, which was a totally different ballgame. So it wasn't a good thing, but it was more of a reality of regular life in the Roman world. You could go into slavery voluntarily. There are a number of different reasons you could end up being a slave. A lot of times it was because of some kind of financial debt, but it was a different thing for different reasons. And still, this is not an endorsement, but Paul's saying, okay, this is the world that we live in. So with our eyes on the prize, how do we continue to show people how good God is? And here he says, well, you can do that even as a slave. And you can do that as someone who's in charge of slaves in the way that you treat one another. There should be a difference in that relationship because of what you believe about Jesus. Like your master-slave working relationship should look different than all the other ones where the masters are exploiting the slaves because they had the power to do that. So he's like, no, don't do that. And then finally, he goes into the reality of spiritual evil. Now, demons and the devil, a lot of times we picture these like cartoonish things, right? Like ideas here in our minds when we think about the reality of spiritual evil. It's a lot more complicated than I think we often make it out to be. A lot of times we talk about like the devil or Satan. It's a very, very complex topic, but the reality is if there's a spiritual good, there's also a spiritual bad. And Paul says like our struggle in life, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against these spiritual forces, these spiritual powers in this unseen realm. And while that's informative, I also think it makes it clear that people are not the enemy. Remember in chapter 2 how he talks about, look, us, like at one point, we were people who lived in a certain way. Like we did things that weren't great, but God showed us grace. And so he's like it's important for us to remember our struggle is not against people. Like when people are doing bad things, he's not saying let them do that. He's saying like remember that they are influenced by these like evil, corrupting powers in the world, like whether it's directly or like indirectly because of structures and values that our world and culture has taught. Ultimately, he would say there are evil forces behind these things. It's important to remember that God cares about these people just like he cares about us, like when we're doing things that are evil. And what's his response to us? Well, it's love and it's pursuit of us for our good. And so be imitators of God, follow God's example, right? We love people who are doing bad things and we don't join in with them, but we want to show them how good God is because God cares about them and we should too. That's also part of our new identity. And so at the end of this letter, we see some he talks about the armor of God. He tells people to put on these different metaphorical pieces of armor, and it's like things like telling the truth. It's things like living with integrity, having faith, all this stuff. This stuff protects us from these spiritual forces that are trying to undermine us. It's also a reference to something that the prophet Isaiah wrote. And for Isaiah says that like the Messiah would wear these things. So Jesus did wear these things, not literally, but he embodied these values that are all connected with these pieces of armor. And so once again, actually, subtly, Paul's saying, follow God's example. Be imitators of God. Like, do just as Jesus did. And so the letter finishes with some goodbyes. Remember, he loves these people. He spent 2 years with them, and he knows a lot of them by name. He mentions some names, and then he finishes with a final greeting, which is another reminder to us that this is a letter written to certain people at a certain time for a certain reason, but there's still so much for us to get out of it. So I hope that this was worth your time. I hope that you take something from this letter, and I hope that you develop like a taste, if you haven't already, for reading the words of these followers of Jesus and thinking about how they can form you and apply in your own life. So thanks for sticking with it. And this is the end. Hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.